I think we will try to start at least one event on time from all that I've moderated so far. Thank you all for being here, and good evening, everyone. I think this promises to be a very engaging event, and I will try not to take too much of the time from our wonderful speakers. We'll center on the legacy of Bertha von Suttner, marking the upcoming International Women's Day. My name is Gabrielė Chlevickaitė, and I'm a researcher in international criminal law here at the Asser Institute, and I'm honored to welcome all of you and to moderate this event. As I mentioned, at the heart of our conversation tonight is Bertha von Suttner, the first woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in 1905 for what the Nobel Committee called her audacity to oppose the horrors of war, an audacity that remains needed today, when more than a century later, armed conflicts continue to escalate, and the call for law, not war, is being drowned out. Gender equality in international law, as in many other fields, remains an unfinished business. And as von Suttner's legacy reminds us, sustainable peace is impossible without addressing this imbalance. Tonight, our distinguished guests will talk about these challenges. A quick overview of how this evening will go. We will first start with the opening speech by Professor Liesbeth Lijnzaad, who I will introduce in a moment, followed by a talk by Ingrid Rollema. We will then continue with a panel discussion joined by Professor Janne Nijman, who is online, and Dr. Priya Pillai, who is here with us. And then we'll finish with a Q&A and close at around 8:45. So as promised, we shall begin with Professor Liesbeth Lijnzaad, chairperson of Asser's supervisory board, the first Dutch judge at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. She has served as the Netherlands' principal legal advisor on public international law and has represented the country in cases before international courts, including International Court of Justice and the US Supreme Court. She is also an endowed professor of practice of international law at Maastricht University and an expert in the law of the sea, the laws of armed conflict, and the law of treaties. I will not take more time for the introduction. Please, Professor Lijnzaad, you have the floor.
Thank you, Gabriella, and good evening, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. It's for me to start off the evening, and I have some notes that I would like to speak to first of all, take us back perhaps a little bit to the history of International Women's Day. Because after all, this evening is in the framework of International Women's Day, which is going to take place next Saturday. Now, I'm only going to make some brief comments, and I just mentioned to somebody that it is intriguing that if you look at Wikipedia, you find information on the Dutch version of Wikipedia that is slightly different from the information on the English version of Wikipedia with respect to International Women's Day. I didn't make a major study of it, but the story appears to start, but some of these facts are contested between the different versions. I didn't check any other language versions. The story of International Women's Day seems to start on 8 March 1908, when in the Lower East Side of New York, a strike was started by female garment workers, so people that worked in the textile industry, and it's a strike about labor conditions. Now, apparently the fact that the strike was a strike by women, who probably were the majority of people employed in that type of work, or the people that were paid least in that type of work, somehow that stuck in people's minds. And in 1910, Clara Zetkin, who became a famous heroine in the German Democratic Republic, she proposes to take 8th of March as International Women's Day at an international conference in Copenhagen. And from 1911 onwards, and 1912 in the Netherlands, there are annual celebrations. In 1917, also on 8 March, there is a strike in St. Petersburg. So the idea has by then traveled from the United States to Russia. I think 1917, it's still sort of towards the end of the Tsarist regime. And it's also a strike only by women about labor conditions in the garment industry. And here stories differ as well. In 1921 or in 1992, there is a more or less formalized decision as to 8 March being International Women's Day. Other versions of the story say that Lenin decided this. I don't know, I wasn't there. But it is interesting that for something as important as Women's Day, we have a variety of stories that we can follow. Celebrations are, I don't know, how would you say that? They are either very intensive and visible, or they're very private. And I think we can safely say that the second period of feminism, so basically starting in the mid-1970s, and again refreshed at the Beijing Women's Conference of 1995, are important events to again get International Women's Day on the agenda. It had been very important in the tradition of Eastern Europe, and after the rekindling of more active feminism in the 1970s and through the Beijing Conference, it was also something that needed to be celebrated elsewhere, such as in Western countries. But let us take a step back before running on. I'd like to draw your attention to the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, which I think is in many respects a remarkable period in recent history. I'd like to focus on 3 different trends that I think are significant. Each of them is significant individually as a trend, but they're also significant in terms of their interaction. The first trend in that period is that the issue of peace is quite clearly on the agenda. So in 1899 and 1907, there are the Hague Peace Conferences. I'd like to suggest, and to those of you who read Dutch, you ought to be reading this book in Dutch. I don't think there is a translation yet, but anyone interested in a translation, I would say give it a go. It's called De Droom van Den Haag by Benjamin Deur, The Dream of The Hague. And it gives you more or less the history that led to these 2 peace conferences. And it is an interesting description, not only of the conferences and of the result, but also of the people who were engaged and their motives and their reasons. Why are they doing this? And why is it happening in The Hague? Now, for me, as someone living in The Hague, that was a very interesting question, but it is really a book worth reading if you read Dutch. Otherwise, we need to find someone who's going to translate. Anyway, so the book describes what happens at these 2 conferences, and obviously Bertha von Suttner appears in the book as well. And the important thing to note about her is she is not a member of any of the delegations participating in those 2 conferences. The conferences are traditional diplomatic conferences with delegations from the states that are interested. Bertha von Suttner is there because of who she is. She's there as a private person, but for a private person, she has a remarkable amount of influence. How did that happen? I suppose we'll get to hear more about that as the evening continues. Another element, another consequence of peace being quite clearly on the agenda in that period is something like building the Peace Palace, because it appeared necessary to people engaged in these discussions to find a building where peaceful settlement of disputes could take place. So finding a building, creating the building, is a step towards making peace possible. So peace is a very important driver in that period. A second trend that I think is important in that period is the growing role of women who are increasingly active in furtherance of peace. Now, von Suttner writes a book. This is the Dutch version. You can buy it in the little shop at the front door of the International Court of Justice. It's a Dutch version, but it has been translated in many languages. The book is not about the whole project of what do we need to do to get peace. It's a novel, but through the novel, she gets her message across. But perhaps also interesting is the International Congress of Women in 1915. Now, the plan had been that after the two peace conferences in The Hague, 1899, 1907, there was to be a third peace conference, but that never materialized because World War I got in the way. However, a group of women were not really intimidated and decided to organize this International Congress of Women for Peace. It's not in the title, but their main goal was we need to address issues of war, of peace and war and law. So remarkable is that this happens during the First World War. It's a huge undertaking. It has the Congress has many participants, more than 1,000, and they also already knew one another from the Women's Suffrage Alliance. So the movement towards, I always get wrong with the emphasis, but anyway, that's an NGO dealing with the right to vote for women. One of the commentators about this event writes that what is innovative about this conference, organized by a group of women that had met one another through another NGO, is a political powerless group is starting to draft proposals for a new international legal system. It takes guts to do something like that. You don't have a seat at the table, but nevertheless, you start drafting plans like that. And the third trend, I already referred to them, are the suffragettes, of course. The movement that is most of all a women's movement to further the right to vote for women. And the message behind that, apart from the right to vote, is of course the whole matter of the participation of women in how society is run. We cannot just be present in society without having a say. In the Netherlands, women got the right to vote in 1919. I think New Zealand takes pride in being the first state to have the right to vote in 1893. So these three trends, I think, are quite significant, each on their own, and they also strengthen one another in that period. However, the story, of course, doesn't end with the work of serious women with big hats appearing in black and white photos. The photos are smashing and the hats are even better, but that's not all. So let me take you to today and the relevance of International Women's Day. Now, the idea of promoting specific days at international level somehow has become a practice in multilateral organizations. And some say, well, the whole business of these days is a bit exaggerated. To give you an example, in 2021, the General Conference of UNESCO established the International Day of Women in Multilateralism. Might be suited to what some of you are doing, suited to me. I work in multilateralism. And then in 2022, the UN General Assembly established the International Day of Women in Diplomacy. Maybe some other people in the audience would find that the day of their liking. I'm sure I didn't investigate this. I'm sure that there is also a day for women in academia. It's just a matter of trawling through all these lists. Now, why do we have all these days to commemorate someone or a category of people? If we read what the UNESCO has written about these days, they say, well, the purpose is it's an occasion to educate the public at large about the importance of a particular category. It's an occasion to mobilize political will and to mobilize resources to address global problems. So I would say global problems, and in particular, global problems relevant to women, I would say. It's an occasion to celebrate and reinforce achievements. And they also say those days are supposedly a powerful tool for advocacy. I think it's important to look back at history. It's an important context for why we have celebrations like that. And I think it's also a trigger to look forward as citizens of the world, as diplomats. So I think days such as International Women's Day and our attention to people, to women who have made their mark on the development of international law, the development of debate about the position of women in international law, in the international society. It's a call to all of us on International Women's Day. Now, keeping in mind, of course, that every period has its own feminism. This must recognize the different roles of women in society and their freedom of choice, as well as the need for empowerment and participation in society. These are not new goals. I'm hopefully not telling you something new. These issues have been on the agenda all along. However, I think they come with a warning that I took from an advertisement for investments. Past performance is no guarantee for future returns. So that means that we must work actively to achieve progress for women. We should not be complacent. We should not rest on our laurels. In historical perspective, a lot has been achieved, but there is so much more to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for priming us to consider where the history sits within today and where today would sit in the future history. And I would now like to turn our attention to a very special guest, Ingrid Rollema, a sculptor known for her public artworks, including a portrait of Bertha von Suttner for the 100th anniversary of the Peace Palace. We also have a small version here on the table, if you would like to have a look. She founded Theatre of Wrong Decisions, blending visual arts and theatre, and for over 33 years, she has worked in Gaza with the Hope Foundation, supporting Palestinian artists, teachers, and children for art and education. Ms. Rollema, please let us know more about Bertha von Suttner's life. You followed her in her footsteps, and we're very much ready to hear from you. You have the floor.
First of all, thank you for coming. Is it on? Okay, thank you for coming, and thank you, organization, for inviting me. Yeah, it was very strange as a sculptor to be invited to make a statue from Bertha von Suttner, because I found out, of course, she is the spiritual mother of the Peace Palace. And when I started to do my investigations, I found out nobody in the Netherlands know who Bertha von Suttner was. So I thought, how is it possible? And it was only in 2007 that Hillary Clinton visited The Hague. And she said to our Lord Mayor, I wanted to sleep in the Kurhaus. And he said, please don't do that. That is impossible for me to protect you. But she said, yeah, I'm going to sleep where Bertha von Suttner has had her saloons. And everybody said, Bertha von Suttner, Bertha von Suttner, who is Bertha von Suttner? So everybody started to look who she was. And oh, there must be a click. Yeah. So they started to find out who she was, and there was now some little buildings named after her, and there came a little street, and it was kind of ridiculous, because you have to imagine that in Germany a lot of schools are named after her, a lot of squares, and etc. etc. And she is on the 2 coin of Austria. So that is really not nothing. So anyway, you have to know, and you mentioned, and thank you for your very nice introduction, because you already made the floor a little bit for me, because she lived in a totally different atmosphere. It is to live as a woman, about be born 200 years ago, that is really something. Just for the taste of the atmosphere, I'll show you now a little clip for just 1 minute. So you can see that it's quite a different atmosphere than we were living in now. So I thought to make somebody, I think it's very important to step into her life. So my publisher, Marianne, and I, we went on traveling, and we first went to Gotha. And you see, Gotha, you see, she has been cremated. And that was forbidden in that time in Austria. So that was also a very big controversial dispute, you know, because she has to be, she died in Vienna, so she has to be transported to Gotha. And that was very, very complicated. But anyway, I thought, oh, that is the first act of resistance, her death. Then I continued, and I went to Prague, because she is born in Prague. And she was for a very high family. And this is the palace where she is born in. So because I was so much astonished, as you already told us, that she could achieve so much, you know. She was at that time the most famous woman of the world. You know, everybody was looking at her, and she was very influential. And I said, how could she manage? But she could manage also because she was born there. And I found out, and it is a lot of gossip, I have to tell you, her mother was a gambler. So, and her mother has been gambling with Dostoevsky. I think that's interesting news. And the father of Kafka had his barber shop over here. And the family of Kafka lived on the other side of the square. So I thought, whoa. And she was speaking French, Italian, German, English, Hungarian language. So she was capable to do a lot of things. But because of her mother made her poor, she wanted that she married to a prince. So there came 3 princes and she refused. And she said, okay, I take the consequences of the position where we are in. So I'm going to work to earn money. And that was something that was really not done. That was so controversial. And then she became the tutor at the family of von Suttner. But something happened. She has to teach 4 daughters, but she fell in love with the eldest son. And he was 7 years younger than she. So the family said, well, we do not agree with this. And they sent her to Paris to work with Alfred Nobel. And I think it's such a beautiful story. That beautiful Bertha von Suttner appeared. She descended from the train. She walked, and then he saw her. And instead of saying, oh, beautiful lady, welcome, or whatever you say, he said, he went on his knees and he said, Madam, is your heart still free? No. that was not. So she started to live, to work with him for 6 weeks. And then she returned to Vienna, and secretly she married the boy von Suttner, the Arthur from Suttner. Yeah. But the families, they didn't agree. So they were banished and they went to the Caucasus. First, they went to this palace in, you should definitely know where it is. It is in Zugdidi. But in Zugdidi, they could only be there for a couple of weeks, and then they have to find a house for their own. And there she started writing, because she witnesses all the terrible things in the war between Russia and Turkey. And then that's where she started to write her novel. And that was mind-blowing, but because it was the first time in history that war was in comment with the people who stayed home and the people who are really, really in a very bad shape and returned. So, and then I hear say in that voyage that Emperor Sissi said, well, these are very valuable people. Please send them home and give them a small castle. So she went home, and she had a lot of reach out, and her book is translated in 16 languages. So when I came home, I thought, well, with every statue you had to make, there must be a real interesting question on the basis of that statue. So I asked Mr. Kooijmans, he was then a former Minister of Outland Affairs. I said, would you please be so kind to talk with me about the statue I have to make? And he said, Ingrid, there's only one relevant question. And it is, who should Bertha von Suttner be today? He said, now you became interesting, and now you became directly in trouble. And he said, is she a member of NoVIP? Could she be a member of Amnesty International? Yeah, could be. And I think today, maybe she was a member of Extinction Rebellion. And if you see there the people who are advocating for peace and how they look like, and those people, how they look like, I think a lot of things have changed. Yeah. And if you think, you know, this is one of your peace conferences, if you think of how they behaved and what you also mentioned, the heads of the people, and if you think about what the people from Amnesty International are doing today, it's completely different, but that is very interesting. I said, okay, well, I go and start to make her. And the people from the Peace Palace who asked me to make that statue, they say there are two statues. There is one statue in the Peace Palace. It's made by Judith Valser, a beautiful statue. And there is one statue outside for the citizens. So that statue of mine was unveiled in the atrium in The Hague, in the town hall. It stands there for 6 weeks. But the, the architect of our town hall does not agree that is there anything else permanent. So the statue has to go to the museum. A museum is a museum adjacent to the art museum, and every child in the Netherlands has to visit that museum. So they say, then we are going to make lessons about peace, that everybody, every child from childhood on is confronted with the questions of peace. But the city of The Hague withdraw money to make a renovation. So the statue came back to the Peace Palace. It's there, and now we are talking in different ways. Okay. This is the photo. I thought this is the age that she is very, very. It's not that she's attractive, but she's creative. She's young, and that is the way that you start thinking, and then that you are so free that you can be open, very against everything. I think this is the age that I want to make her. So, yeah. So I thought this is in bronze with gold, with her signature. Yeah. This is, you know, the part of a cannon, but it is not a cannon who is round, but it is an oval. So it will never shoot. And we are continuing with arguing, where do we put it? Yeah. And then I said, well, why don't you put it in front of the Peace Palace? Because so many people are always going there and the Peace Palace is closed. Everybody is making selfies, so they can go, and with the QR code, you can bring out the message of Bertha von Suttner. You can give information, and you have not been visiting the Peace Palace for nothing, that you're standing outside. You can gain something. There is something extra. Yeah. It's of course, it's trucage. It's not there. It's inside. I don't know. Is it the message of total disarmament? Is it this? We don't know. But anyway, it's 12 years ago that I make that I make this statue. But it is, yeah, it is a really kind of a Bertha von Suttner situation that it went like this. I would say, but anyway. It gives me a lot of information, and it gives me also a lot of friendship, because when Alfred Nobel died, Mr. Andrew Carnegie in America said, whoa, now am I the richest man on earth? So what a responsibility. So Bertha von Suttner, she went to America, and she talked to him, and she could persuade him. And she said, you must install a court of arbitrage, because it's so outdated to go on war. And he was quite convinced. So he went to Europe. And Carnegie, and this story I got from his granddaughter, Linda. Linda Carnegie told me her grandfather went to all the courts, to all the presidents, to all the kings and queens, and even the Tsar. And everybody promised with the hand on his heart, from, I will not start a war. No, there's peace. And if there is a trouble, we go to the International Court of Arbitrage. And it was in 1914, just a year after the Peace Palace was opened, that the First World War broke out. And she told me, my grandfather was a broken man from that on. He had had so many dreams and he had so much believed in the Bertha von Suttner. And Bertha von Suttner had always had very good friends. Let's say Alfred Nobel has always been also a very good friend for her. Her whole life, because he was a man of honor, his whole life he had stand behind her. If she was in financial troubles, he supported her. But she always said, you must install a peace prize. And then he said, how can you ask that from me? I'm the inventor of the dynamite. So I live from war. Think, you cannot ask that from me. But when he passed away, he had to install the peace prize. So that was a very good thing. And later, very much later, I was always thinking from, how is it possible that we here in the Netherlands do not know who Bertha von Suttner is? I went also to Hilversum and I looked to all kinds of old material for films, and I see that she's cut out. She's cut out. A very high-class lady in the Netherlands has given order to cut it out. She did not agree with the idea of peace, and she did not agree with the whole movement, and she did not agree with the appearance. She did not agree with nothing. So it took 100 years to bring her back. I think that is very interesting. Justice at the end. And you told me in the introduction, that I'm working in Gaza. I work for 33 years in Gaza now. What Bertha von Suttner really made her go for what she did is that, listen, think. It will not take long that men start to fly. If men start to fly, men start bombing. All the citizens in the world are hostage. Ladies and gentlemen, this child, she will live. It's our responsibility. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. And we also, I think, all wish that war was a thing of the past, was outdated to go to war, and we should just all go to PCA. I think that's a nice dream to have. I think we're now ready to delve into critical questions raised in the opening and inspired by Bertha von Suttner's story. And please let me introduce our patiently waiting esteemed panelists. May we have Janne on the screen? I think I see the tech working on it. We have one speaker online. Yes. Hi, Janne. Hi, nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you for so patiently waiting throughout the introductions and the initial parts. I'd like to introduce you Professor Janne Nijman. She is Professor of History and Theory of International Law at the University of Amsterdam School of Law and Senior Fellow of the Amsterdam Center for International Law. She is also Professor of International Law at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, and a former chairperson of the executive board of the T.M.C. Asser Institute and as academic director until 2022. I'll introduce Priya as well before giving Professor Nijman the floor. Priya Pillai, who is to my right, is an international lawyer with over 2 decades of experience and is executive director of the Asia Justice Coalition, helming it since its inception in 2019. The coalition has been key to efforts to hold the Burmese military accountable by supporting legal proceedings domestically and internationally. The coalition is also working on enhancing leadership of women in international law across Asian jurisdictions. Previously, Priya worked at the UN International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia here in The Hague and at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in Geneva. Welcome and thank you for being here. Since we have 2 guests who have not been given the floor yet, as a first order of business, I would now finally let Professor Nijman to have a word. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you to the whole ASSER team. I think I see the eye of detail with purple or pink ribbons there. That's how we know the ASSER team. So thank you so much. So it's an important day to mark International Women's Day, and especially today and in these times, I think. So it's a real pleasure, and I'm very, very sorry I cannot be with you in person. It has already been such a rich evening, and so much has already been told about Bertha von Suttner. As some of you know, I published a piece on her, which was more on the historical part in 2023, more historical in its nature. And what I want to do today is see what we can take from a turn to her life and work for us, what that work and life can do for us and for in terms of inspiration and action. So I understand it as a threefold call to action. And the remarks I gave, the title of Silence is Not an Option. So I'll try to be brief because it's always good to exchange and have Q&As. But as previous speakers rightly and beautifully already narrated, she was a lady who went against the current and maybe even currents of her time. She lived amidst militarism, patriotism, imperial violence, European and colonial warfare in a world of patriarchy and masculine power, a time of sexism and contempt of female intellect, a time of, and here I quote, therapeutic nihilism, and of quote, and a time of contempt of reason. And she contested this and came with proposals for change. She resisted with female practices, and she resisted men who were making fun of her. She was brave and stubborn, and I think a lot of that was already made very clear from previous presentations. She was a true feminist, taking a feminist perspective as a method in her work and as a political agenda. So before becoming a peace activist and a contributor to the development of international law, she was a journalist. She reported, as you just learned, from the Caucasus together with her husband for years, and in particular about the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878. She even also took wounded soldiers in their home, treated them. But for now and for one, I want to honor her as a journalist. Throughout her life, journalists would be part of her circle, of her scene, in her salon in The Hague as well. She was always a trait d'union between the movement, the circle of experts she had around her, and the public debate. So I would like to honor not only her as a journalist, but as a war journalist and someone who reported on experience, being at the scene, report facts-based, truthfully. And through that, I would like to honor today all those journalists, photojournalists, and women who are doing that work, that important work that's crucial, I would say, for healthy democracies and for us as citizens. So let us support journalists and take her as an example of the braveness that is required. And we see through the picture that were just shown also scenes where tremendous casualties, also human suffering, but also casualties among journalists are taking place. So for me, it's important to think about her life also as an example of braveness and an example of that courage that journalists show, and that we, I think, should cherish her attempts to counter warfare through journalism, free press, and the suffering it takes. Now, secondly, I would say that at a time of militarism, nationalism, that glorification of warfare and also a glorification of the sacrifice it takes, she was a peace worker, obviously. Her message was peace through law, And she delivered it in a very creative way. I mentioned already the female practices. She used a novel, best-selling, you already learned about that, and she held and hosted a salon. She wrote and spoke about the social conventions that maintained the culture of war that we talked about already. And she accused and talked about these conventions and practices that locked women in particular places in society, and in particular in the place of breeding children for the military. And she attacked the praise of the way children were raised and daughters were raised to admire military uniforms. So she really talked about pedagogical practices and how those produced the people that either embraced the culture of war or resisted it. She mobilized Kantian thinking against Hegelian thinking, and as the salonière, she was making use of a social institution to protect international institutions, or rather, I should say, to advocate for international institutions. And she realized how important international institutions were and how they were a way to peace and justice. And I think that also can inspire us today. I mean, these institutions that, as previous speakers were saying, she stood at the foundation, at the construction sites. These institutions need to be protected. International law is not perfect. International law and international organizations have to change. But as we speak, our international legal order is under attack and it needs to be defended. Now, as scholars, we know that cynicism and skepticism are easily part of our conversations, and constructive perspectives have not been popular, nor understood as historically, as intellectually rewarding. And I think we have to be careful there. International law and international institutions are in dire need of reform, but a world without international law, public values of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, a world without international institutions is not a better world. So Bertha von Suttner was mocked by the intellectuals of her time for her lack of nihilism, her lack of cynicism. Let's follow her path. We live in a time that international law and international institutions need to be defended, and we need to rally for human rights, women's rights, and the rule of law. Finally, and very brief, I'm running out of time, one sentence, but with her writings, she mobilized two sometimes overlapping social movements, and Professor Lijnzaad also mentioned that. The peace movement and the women's movement. So let's look at ourselves. She understood the power of people, the power of international law, and peace from below. So with Bertha von Suttner, I would say international law and justice need people, need women, need us. That's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janne. And I think it's a very nice reminder that people make up institutions and the institutions are what we defend. I will now give the floor to Priya before we move on to the discussion.
Thank you so much. And I just want to first thank the Asser Institute and everybody involved in inviting me. And I think it's always very hard, especially to follow a stellar panel like this. So, please forgive me for a few repetitions and maybe, really repeating some of the things that have already been said before. So I think for me, when Gabrielle invited me to speak and be part of this panel, it really did make me stop and pause to really think about the life of this individual who was really a trailblazer for her time and what it means to us now in this moment. And, I would say I'm always a glass half full sort of person, not half empty, but I definitely think the last few years have tested a lot of us in this space. There are questions around international law, there are questions around international norms, there are attacks on international institutions. And so I think for me, it was really a reflection of what can I glean or learn from the life of this woman in the 1800s, a very different time, a time that was much more constrictive, that, freedoms were much less, and how she managed to really, forge this path in extremely difficult circumstances. And so what does that mean for us now? And what does that mean in this current moment in time? So I think particularly now, I would like to also emphasize that we are not in peaceful times at all. We have violent conflicts raging in the DRC, in Sudan, in Myanmar, in Ukraine, in Gaza. So when we're talking about peace activism, or what it means to work in this international space and defend human rights and defend international norms, including IHL, the norms of war, human rights law, where do we stand right now? And I would really emphasize the point that has just been made by Professor Nijman as well, that we actually need to double down. And I think, if anything, the biggest lesson from Bertha von Suttner's life is to keep forging that path and to keep on the path of activism, whichever way or shape that takes, whether that's research, whether that's advocacy, whether that's working in international institutions, multilateralism, diplomacy. I think there are many ways that we can forge this path and that we can move forward. So I think for me, that was one of the biggest sort of reflections when thinking about her life and hearing about her incredible life and activism and work. I think the other thing that I would also say is that since her trailblazing sort of path, there have been many other women as well along the way who have made incredible contributions. So if you fast forward to the 1940s, 1946, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you had Eleanor Roosevelt from the US, you had Hansa Mehta from India, you had Minerva Bernardino from the Dominican Republic, and a score of other women who were diplomats, who were parts of delegations, who actually helped change the language of the UDHR in a way that it was, equality focused, that it centered the experiences and lives of women as well. And I think this sort of brings me to the point, Ingrid, that you made, which was sort of the invisibilization of women. And I think that's happened a lot in the international sphere, where women have made contributions and then they are forgotten, or they are actually sort of erased from history as well. And I think that's something that we also need to keep in mind, that is a way of relegating women's roles in a lot of these spaces to a really minor, side footnote in a way. And I think that's something that we need to be quite mindful of and resist as well quite actively. I think I'll bring it now to fairly specifics, some of the things that I've been working on. So at the Asia Justice Coalition, we have a 4-year program to look at women in international justice and accountability, and sort of to look at where the gaps are in the domestic system, in the international legal system. Why are women not represented enough? And this is a way of trying to approach the problem from a grassroots perspective. So we're trying to do multiple things at the same time, perhaps. But I think it's important to just understand also that there are really deep structural and systemic reasons for the lack of women in these spaces. And many a time that really starts from the profession. It starts from domestic practice, from barriers to entry, but then not just barriers to entry. What happens after you enter the legal profession? Where are the roadblocks or the stumbling blocks in a way once you start that path? And if you look at the sort of international courts and tribunals around us, and we're very lucky we have a judge from one of the tribunals, but again, this is quite rare. You have very few women at the international court level, and I'm sure the journey has been long and quite hard. And I think that's again something that when you look at the statistics of a lot of these judicial bodies, you realize that the statistics are quite stark and they are quite terrifying actually. And I think I really want to emphasize and make the point that it is a matter of access to justice. It is a matter of who creates international norms, and that 50% of the world's population needs to have a say in that. It's not just a matter of women's issues, quote unquote, because that becomes the perspective very often to say, well, you need women in these spaces because they will focus on particular issues, sexual and gender-based violence, or, some of these fairly specific issues. Yes, that is correct, but it is more than that. It is also a matter of equity and equality and access to justice broadly writ and in the international legal sphere as well. So, I really want to emphasize that point as well. And I would say if you sort of zoom back down to domestic jurisdictions and look at the role of the judiciary, perhaps, in a lot of these jurisdictions, the statistics are again quite stark. On average, higher judiciary, and I've looked at the US, the UK, Brazil, Singapore, India, a few other countries, it averages between like 25 to 32% of women, which is again fairly stark, and it's usually on the lower end, not really on the higher end. So all that to say that there's a lot of work that we still need to do, but I do want to highlight a few positives and a few things that have been happening in the last year, which are actually quite important. So I think there's a lot of work that is being done. A lot of academics, researchers, professionals, lawyers are working quite actively to try to change the environment and to try to make it a more enabling environment where women can succeed and can sort of move forward through the obstacles that are placed either at the domestic level, but also at the international level. And I think in terms of the international spaces, one of the really important developments that has happened for the first time is that the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination of Women, CEDAW, has come out with a new general recommendation on one particular article within the convention, which is an article that deals with the equal representation of women in international spaces. So they've had a very detailed consultative process. It's taken about 1.5 years, and they've actually come out with this recommendation last year. So that's something really positive to build upon. And I think that's a very powerful tool as well to use as we move forward in democratizing the space and in ensuring that half of the world's population has more of a say in the development of international norms and in advocating and pushing for a more peaceful planet as well. So I'll stop with that, but yeah, thank you very much.
My assistant just walked into the room. So this means that we will continue with a sort of mixed panel discussion and Q&A in view of the time. And I will, as usual, use my moderator's privilege while you are thinking of your questions to ask the first question to the panel. And I have a lot of thoughts and a lot of questions floating about, but I think I want to return a little bit to von Suttner's legacy and her critique of international humanitarian law for humanizing war rather than abolishing it, rather than being against it. And I wonder what your thoughts are in relation to where we are today in legal responses to war. In some instances, having no response, in some instances, strengthening or trying to strengthen protections against the crime of aggression. So I would just like to hear your thoughts on that. Perhaps, Liesbeth, you would like to be first? I will continue doing this and pointing at the panelists. But you think of the questions for...
Thank you. Well, that was a big, heavy question, no? I think if you, there's a difference between what is achievable in international law and what international law would ideally look like. Now, I probably have worked for government for far too long, so I'm being inclined to look at what is achievable. So the idea of banning war, that was something that came up in this third Hague conference, where that was something that was obviously on the agenda. It was something that was at the basis of the League of Nations, but it failed quite visibly. Also, I would like to say, well, in terms of, this is the professor speaking, in terms of systematics, banning war and addressing aggression is really something pertaining to the jus ad bellum. This is whether or not you may use force to settle whatever problem you have with your neighbors or any other state. That's a different thing from the jus in bello, which is about how to conduct war. and it's important not to confuse the two. There is always, I think, a misunderstanding, and an unfortunate misunderstanding, that if you address the conduct during times of armed conflict, you are thereby implicitly facilitating the mere existence of armed conflict. I don't think that is correct. And I think that happily, in a way, that's a bit of a strange term, but it is in a way positive, you could say it's positive, that we have international humanitarian law, particularly for those situations where armed conflict exists, irrespective of the question as to whether we got into that armed conflict was legitimate or not. So yes, I am a full supporter of banning armed conflict. Do I think it's realistic? Well, I'm not sure. I'd like to support that, but in terms of realism, I'm not sure we're going to achieve it.
Pragmatism never hurts. I also have a question to Professor Nijman, and it has to do with the structural barriers to gender equality and representation of women, especially in these higher levels of international legal institutions. How do you assess the progress that has been made from the time of Bertha, that you have covered in your work as well, to today, and what still remains that prevents meaningful gender equality for shaping international justice and international law? Again, a difficult question.
Thank you. Yeah, a difficult question, and maybe also there's Priya on the panel who just referred to it, who can add to my answer. The structural barriers obviously are there, and they're still there, and they're still there also, not so much in your face as subtle practices, and it's so it really helps also that one, as women and men, really talk about these things and make them surface and have concerted action. So find your allies there. And the argument that it's necessary, I think it's very, very necessary, and it was just mentioned by Priya. You talk about representation. You talk about 50% of world's population that should be part of the law making, law implementing, law applying processes, and the norm setting and the conceptualizations that we bring to social reality through law and legal norms. So I think it's still there, and even more troublesome. Some of the numbers show that things are becoming worse again, and the violence against women worldwide is tremendous. Femicide, just now in the news today, there were reports of UN Women also critiquing the Netherlands. So I think what the Secretary General today was saying, or somewhere at the UN quarters, that it really needs more action and more structural international response, and CEDAW is doing that, but it needs much more attention from all of us.
Thank you. Priya, do you have something to add? No. Okay. Do we have any questions from the audience? If you could raise your hand, and just a warning, the event is being recorded, so you will end up on the recording if you ask a question. Yes, please go ahead, Henry. Yes. Please wait for the microphone.
Yeah, no, I just reminded the visit of of Bertha von Suttner to the women's exhibition in summer 1913, which showed the full spectrum of women's struggle for legal rights, also economic, social, private rights. And at the same time, it was the development of the Hague Conference of Private International Law, Tobias Asser's dream, for the protection of what he called vital civil rights. Now, also the conventions on marriage, on civil procedure. Now the question is, if you look to that level today, the Hague Conference of Private International Law, participation of women on that level, and protection of women's rights at that level, in the field, especially in the field of private and civil rights. Is there anything to say about that, about progress being made?
Yes, please, thank you.
Thank you. I'm not a private international law expert. Let me say that up front. However, what I would say is that if you look from a distance to private international law, it has certainly been influenced by the general debate about not just the human rights of women, but about ensuring that the law is not based on stereotypes. So the gender aspect has been considered, and I think it's helpful that you're pointing out that that particular conference that Bertha von Suttner visited in Amsterdam, I think in the Paleis voor Volksvlijt, was it not, before it burned down, that this whole making the point that it is about a broad range of women's rights, more or less the range of women's rights that is today included in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which has traditional civil and political rights, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights. I think there was an awareness, but of course, that movement, to my mind, I'm not the final biographer of Bertha von Suttner, but the movement and the atmosphere at the end of the 19th century was very much focused on peace. We need peace, and gradually there is a certain impatience because, well, men can keep talking, but we want to get more concrete, hence this International Women's Conference. So it grows from an idea about participation, wanting participation in discussions about peace, and then with, to my mind, the influence of another discussion about the right to vote, which is more directly linked to participation, gradually it becomes a broader discussion. I would like to also take the opportunity to perhaps refer back to a comment that was made by Priya. The general comments on Article 7 and 8 of the Women's Convention. Article 7 is about political rights in the domestic sphere, and Article 8 is about equal treatment in the sphere of international relations, so the position of diplomats, etc. Now, it's a very lengthy document. These general comments keep growing. But the committee, supervisory committee, is quite clear. What we're after is parity. It's not just let's help the women do this or that, but it is parity. That's what we want. And that message is directly related to a report, I think from 2 or 3 years ago, in which a study was made as to the composition of lots of bodies in the field of human rights law that had supervisory roles. Well, no need to guess, but the composition of all these bodies is extremely biased. In the Women's Committee, you see a wide majority of women, but for all the other UN bodies, it's a majority of men, and that should change. What I personally like about the report, apart from the fact that it really gives you a picture, it's like a photograph on a particular date of, well, who are the people in all these supervisory bodies? That's helpful. What I think is also very helpful is that it more or less ends by saying, and by the way, the concern need not be only human rights bodies. It should be other bodies in the UN as well. Like, is this whole debate about participation and parity, is that a debate for those instances where you can say, but they're dealing with women's stuff? Or is this, for instance, about, there is a committee on geographical names. Do we want parity there as well? Don't we want parity in bodies like the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf? I think we want that, because the whole debate, I think, is not just about we need women to take care of women because they understand better. There are lots of things that women are experts in. So maybe there is a need to also push a little bit in another direction. Let's try and achieve parity across the board. But I digress, so I'll give the floor.
That was a great digression, starting with a disclaimer, but do we have any other questions in the audience? Please.
I am a PhD candidate at the University of Florence in Italy, but I just arrived as a PhD. So first of all, many thanks for this amazing conference. Okay. During my dissertation at university, I dealt with the appointment of arbitrators and as well as with technology. So my question is, what do you think about whether technology might be helpful to help the gender equality and or to at least resolve or prevent conflicts? And the last thing I wanted just to share, as we got a book advice at the very beginning, I would like to share a movie advice. There is an Italian movie called There Is Still Tomorrow, C'è ancora domani, the Italian title, which actually talks about the importance of vote for women. Unfortunately, we got the vote for women just in 1946 in Italy, but how important is the vote for women to achieve the gender equality? So I wanted also to share this. I thought it was important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And are you addressing the question to anyone in particular or the whole panel? Okay. I think perhaps if we want to address technology and armed conflict, I can turn to Professor Nijman. This is like.
Sorry. No, thank you. I'm not sure I'm the one to talk about technology. There are all kinds of experts at the IAS Institute. But it's related, I think I didn't hear it completely, but related to how technology can improve gender equality. Was that the question?
Yes.
Yeah, gender equality and or to prevent conflicts or solve conflict as well. As we talk about technology, gender equality and conflict. So
no, thank you so much. And it's very, very relevant at a time that technology is all around us and increasingly around us. And I'm not so optimistic about technology solving our conflicts. I'm actually very, very concerned about how technology is increasing and accelerating conflict dynamics. And so I talked about journalism and the importance of high quality journalism and photojournalism. I think that's a place where humans need to be in control and stay in control. I think that we need the healthy press, and that means no monopolist. That means the ethos of journalists and not anything goes on social media. So I'm fairly concerned, to be frank, about what's happening with AI and digital technologies more generally. So that has been more on my mind, I must admit, than solving conflicts through technology.
Thank you, Janne, and I think that concern is shared. Priya, would you have something to add? I saw you nodding.
Just to add to that, I mean, technology isn't agnostic. I mean, I think we've all seen facial recognition technology. I mean, there are issues with how the algorithms are developed. So if you have, if you have developers that are largely male that are developing these algorithms, I'm not sure necessarily that there's a solve there. I mean, there still is a human at the back end as well. And I think the only other thing I will add, since you did mention an Italian film, there's a Netflix series on Lidia Poet, who's an Italian lawyer. I don't know how many of you have seen that, but I found that quite interesting as well in terms of this push for gender equality in the law. So I'll stop with that.
I think we will.
Highly recommend.
I think we will have to make an event page with recommendations after this one. There's probably more in the room than we could cover. And unfortunately, we are out of time. I'm sorry that we ran a little bit late, and many thank you for your questions and your responses. And I would like to conclude. I would like to thank our speakers, also Professor Nijman online, as well as our events team, our IT support team, our interns who were helping out. And I would also like to thank you, the audience, for being here. Before you go, this year, the Asser Institute is celebrating its 60th anniversary, so there will be many events coming up. And next week, on the 13th of March, you can join a talk show, Unlocking International Law, at the West Den Haag, an art venue in The Hague. And keep an eye on our events page or our newsletter to be informed of all the other events to come. And with that, I would like to wish you a good evening.